Imagine this. A historian walks into an abandoned military bunker. Inside, he discovers a single sheet of paper. On it, only one sentence survives. Find them wherever they are, and kill them. Nothing else? No date, no author, no country, no war, no surrounding pages. Just that one sentence. Now imagine someone publishes it online. Within hours, millions of people are outraged. Whoever wrote this must have been a monster. This proves they loved violence. This document promotes murder. Now imagine discovering another page. Suddenly you learn the document was written during the final stages of a brutal war. The soldiers receiving that order had already watched their towns attacked, their families displaced, their peace treaties violated. The enemy army was advancing once again. Suddenly, the order number longer sounds like murder. It sounds like survival. It means, find the enemy wherever you encounter them on the battlefield. Before they find you, before they burn another town, before they break another treaty, before they kill again. Because an army that waits to be slaughtered protects no one. A soldier cannot defend his family by refusing to defend himself. A commander who tells his soldiers to stand still until the enemy strikes first is not issuing a moral command. He is signing their death warrant. Now everything changes. Not because the words changed, but because history finally caught up with them. Suppose a police officer shouts, "Shoot!" Those 5 letters alone sound horrifying. But what if that command was given during a hostage rescue, seconds before an innocent child was killed? The word hasn't changed. The situation has. No reasonable person concludes that police officers spend their lives searching for people to kill. Language has never existed in isolation. It always belongs to a moment, a people, a circumstance, a purpose. That is why courts examine context. Historians examine context. Journalists are supposed to examine context. Without it, words become weapons. A sentence can be made to prove almost anything. And that brings us to one of the most controversial verses in the Qur'an. Perhaps no verse has been quoted more frequently, or quoted more incompletely. Again and again, it appears in headlines, television debates, books, social media posts, sometimes with absolute confidence. Kill the polytheists wherever you find them. For many people, the case is closed. No further questions, no surrounding verses, no historical background, no inquiry into who was being addressed, or why. Just one sentence, presented as though it explains an entire religion. But imagine applying that method to any other document in history. Imagine judging an entire constitution by one sentence, an entire courtroom verdict by one paragraph, an entire military operation by one battlefield command. No serious historian would accept that standard. So why is it so often accepted here? Before deciding what a verse means, shouldn't we first ask the same questions we would ask of every historical document? Who was speaking? Who was being addressed? What had happened beforehand? Was this a universal command, or a battlefield order issued during a specific war? Because history has a remarkable habit. The deeper we investigate, the more complicated simple slogans become. and that is exactly where this investigation begins. The question is no longer whether the words sound harsh. They do. Battlefield orders almost always do. Because wars are not fought through philosophical essays. They are fought through commands, clear, short, direct, unmistakable. Orders designed to be obeyed, not debated. Imagine a commander standing before thousands of soldiers moments before battle. The enemy is advancing. The battle has begun. Now imagine hearing him give the order, "Find ISIS wherever you find them, and kill them." Would non-Muslims want Muslims to hear that and conclude they want to kill Muslims wherever they find them? Of course not. They would immediately object. That's not what we meant. We meant ISIS. You're taking the order out of context. Suddenly, context becomes essential. Who is ISIS? Why was the order given? What happened beforehand? Who was actually being addressed? So why should the Qur'an be treated differently? When it records a battlefield command, why are those very same questions so often abandoned? History is full of them. Advance! Hold the line! Take the hill! Fire! Destroy the bridge! Leave no enemy combatants behind you. Read those commands in a history book, and they make perfect sense. Read them without knowing they were spoken during war, and they sound monstrous. Nothing about the words changed, only the setting. That distinction matters, because language always belongs to the circumstances in which it is spoken. Military orders do not appear out of nowhere. They always have a history behind them. The order is a response, not the beginning of the story. And this is precisely where so many discussions about the Qur'an quietly begin. Not at the beginning, but in the middle. People begin reading in the middle of a war, then assume they have discovered the beginning of Islam. But history refuses to work that way. History always asks, what happened before this? Because causes matter. Events matter. Chronology matters. Without them, even truthful words become misleading. Which brings us to another question that is almost never discussed. If this verse was revealed during a military conflict, what conflict? Who were these people? What had they done? Why had the situation reached the point where fighting was even being discussed? Because if we ignore those questions, we are no longer reading history. We are reading isolated sentences and asking them to carry the weight of an entire civilization. That is a burden no historical document was ever meant to bear. So before reading the command itself, let us step back. To understand a battlefield order, we must first understand the battlefield, not the slogan, not the quotation, the history. By the time Surah At-Tawbah was revealed, the Muslim community was no longer the small, persecuted group that had once endured years of oppression at the hands of the Polytheists of Makkah. Much had happened. Years of conflict between the Muslims and the Polytheists of Makkah. Years during which trust had repeatedly been broken by the Polytheists of Makkah and their allies. Years during which every attempt at peace faced the constant threat of renewed aggression from the Polytheists of Makkah and their allies. One event in particular changed everything. A treaty had been established. Not simply a pause in fighting, but a formal agreement between the Muslims and the Quraysh the polytheist leaders of Makkah who had fought them for years. It represented something every civilization depends upon: trust. Because treaties are more than pieces of parchment. They are promises. Promises that allow communities to lay down their weapons. Promises that prevent endless bloodshed. But what happens when those promises are deliberately broken? History has answered that question many times. In 1938, Britain and France signed the Munich Agreement with Nazi Germany to prevent another European war. Germany promised that once it annexed the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, it would make no further territorial demands. Peace was preserved for a moment. But only months later, Nazi Germany broke the agreement by occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia. Then, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France concluded that the agreement had been broken beyond repair and declared war on Germany. Once the treaty was no longer honoured, the peace it had created collapsed. A treaty that is repeatedly violated eventually ceases to be a guarantee of peace. It becomes an illusion. This was the world into which Surah At-Tawbah was revealed. The command did not appear at the beginning of Islam, nor at the beginning of Muhammad's mission, nor during the 13 long years in Makkah, when the Qur'an had not yet permitted Muslims to fight back, despite enduring persecution. Not while they were mocked by the Polytheists of Makkah. Not while they were tortured by the Polytheists of Makkah. Not while they were driven from their homes by the Polytheists of Makkah. Not while the Polytheists of Makkah confiscated their property. Not while some Muslims were killed by the Polytheists simply for believing. It came much later, after the Muslims had been forced to leave Makkah and seek refuge in Medina because of persecution by the Polytheists of Makkah. After those same Polytheists of Makkah repeatedly marched armies against them in an effort to destroy the new Muslim community in Medina. After years of warfare fought in and around Medina, as the Muslims defended themselves against successive military campaigns launched by the Polytheists of Makkah and their allies. After repeated attempts by the Polytheists of Makkah and their allies to eliminate the Muslim community, altogether had failed. After a peace treaty had finally been signed between the Muslims and the Quraysh, the polytheist leaders of Makkah, bringing years of fighting to an end. After that treaty had been violated by the Quraysh and their polytheist allies, drawing Arabia back toward conflict and ultimately leading to the peaceful surrender of Makkah. And even then, the story was not over. Arabia was still divided among numerous tribes. Many polytheist tribes had their own treaties with the Muslims. Some of those polytheist tribes honoured their agreements, others violated them. Some supported hostile alliances against the Muslims. Some prepared for renewed war. It was into that world, not the world of peaceful coexistence, not the beginning of Islam, but the closing chapter of more than 2 decades during which the polytheists of Makkah had persecuted the Muslims, marched armies against them, signed peace treaties with them, and watched some of their allied polytheist tribes violate those agreements. That Surah At-Tawbah was revealed. Only then does the Qur'an speak with the language of the battlefield. That sequence matters. Because chronology matters. Imagine reading a courtroom verdict without ever hearing the trial. Imagine reading the final page of a detective novel without reading the investigation. The conclusion would seem arbitrary, perhaps even unjust. Not because the conclusion was wrong, but because the story that justified it had been removed. History works the same way. By the time this command was revealed, the question was no longer whether peace was desirable. Everyone desires peace. The question had become, how should a community respond when peace agreements are repeatedly broken? Should it simply wait until the next attack begins? Until more lives are lost? Until the enemy strikes first? Again? No military commander thinks that way. A community that refuses to defend itself is a community preparing for its own destruction. Yet for 13 years, the Muslims had done precisely the opposite. Not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked the ability to fight, but because Allah had not yet permitted them to do so. When Allah commanded restraint, they obeyed. When Allah later commanded them to fight those hostile polytheist tribes that had repeatedly violated their agreements and resumed their aggression, they obeyed again. The authority to decide when human life may lawfully be taken never belonged to them. It belonged to Allah. Islam does not command people to stand still while they are slaughtered. Nor does it glorify suicide. On the contrary, human life is sacred. The Quran declares that saving a single life is as though one has saved all of humanity. That life includes your own. A soldier entrusted with protecting his family, his community, his fellow soldiers, cannot fulfill that duty by refusing to protect himself. Sometimes the only way to prevent the next attack is to stop the attacking enemy before he reaches you. That is not the rejection of peace. It is the preservation of life. Modern governments still face that question. If an armed group repeatedly violates ceasefires, attacks civilians, breaks negotiated agreements, no government simply pretends those events never happened. Eventually, action follows, not because peace has lost its value, but because peace cannot survive if agreements carry no consequences. This is precisely the historical setting into which one of the Qur'an's most quoted verses appears. Kill the polytheists wherever you find them. Read in isolation. It sounds terrifying. Read within its historical setting. It reads like what it is. A battlefield directive addressed to those polytheist tribes that had repeatedly violated their agreements, resumed hostilities, and rejected the peace they themselves had pledged to uphold. But something remarkable happens next, something that is rarely quoted alongside it. The very next verse declares, "And if any one of the polytheists seeks your protection, then grant him protection so that he may hear the words of Allah. Then escort him to a place of safety." Pause for a moment. The very polytheist tribes that had repeatedly broken their agreements with the Muslims. If one of those tribes seeks protection, must be protected. Not abused, not executed. Protected. And not merely protected temporarily. Escorted to a place where they are safe. Think about what that means. The battlefield has not erased moral responsibility. The enemy has not ceased to be human, even during conflict. The obligation to protect life remains. This is not the language of indiscriminate violence. It is the language of controlled warfare, force, bounded by ethics, power, restrained by principle. Whether one believes the Quran to be divine revelation is a matter of faith. But historically, the command looks very different once the surrounding verses and historical circumstances are allowed to speak. The problem was never the existence of context. The problem is that context is so often removed. The verse survives, the history disappears, the command remains, the circumstances vanish. And once that happens, almost any document in history can be made to say something its original audience would never have understood. Which brings us to one final question. If no serious historian would judge a military archive, a legal verdict, or a political speech without first examining its context, why is the Quran so often expected to stand trial without the very history that gave its verses meaning? That question takes us beyond one verse and into something much deeper. Not simply how we read the Quran, but how we decide what counts as honest history in the first place. So let us return to where this investigation began. One sentence, one verse, one quotation, lifted from its history, detached from its audience, separated from the events that gave it meaning. Now ask yourself something. Would we ever read history this way anywhere else? Context is not an excuse. It is evidence. Without that evidence, history becomes something dangerous. Not because the documents are false, but because we have stopped reading them honestly. Imagine walking into the middle of a conversation. The first words you hear are, "Leave immediately." Cruel? Perhaps. Unless the building is collapsing, or someone has just threatened violence, or poisonous gas is filling the room. Suddenly, the same words carry an entirely different meaning. Nothing changed except the missing information. Context did not change the truth. Context revealed it. That principle is so obvious that we teach it to children. We ask them not to judge before hearing both sides. Courts hear witnesses before delivering verdicts. Historians reconstruct events before reaching conclusions. Journalists, at least in principle, are expected to present surrounding facts before asking the public to form an opinion. Why? Because without context, justice itself becomes impossible. Which brings us back to the Quran. If one verse is presented without the verses surrounding it, if a battlefield command is detached from the war that produced it, if years of persecution of Muslims by the Polytheists of Makkah, if peace treaties with the Muslims repeatedly violated by hostile polytheist tribes, if repeated acts of aggression against the Muslims by those very tribes, and the very next verse commands Muslims to grant protection to any polytheist who seeks safety, are all quietly removed, what remains is no longer the Quran. It is an edited quotation, a fragment, a sentence carrying a burden it was never intended to carry alone. And perhaps that explains why this particular verse has generated so much confusion. Not because it is impossible to understand, but because it is so often introduced stripped of the very history that explains it. Notice something remarkable. Throughout this entire investigation, We have not asked anyone to accept the Qur'an as the word of God. We have asked something much simpler. Apply the same historical method here that you would apply anywhere else. Nothing more, nothing less. If context is necessary to understand a courtroom judgment, then it is necessary to understand a battlefield order. If context is necessary to understand a political speech, then it is necessary to understand a Qur'anic verse. If context is necessary to understand every serious historical document, then it cannot suddenly become optional when the document is the Qur'an. Because intellectual honesty does not change according to the book being examined. Either context matters, or it does not. And if it matters everywhere else, then it must matter here as well. So the next time someone presents a single verse as proof that Islam commands indiscriminate violence, pause. Before accepting the conclusion, ask the questions every historian asks. Who was being addressed? What had happened beforehand? What comes immediately after? What was the historical situation? Because those questions are not acts of faith, they are acts of scholarship. And perhaps the greatest tragedy in discussions about Islam is not that difficult questions are asked. Difficult questions should be asked. The tragedy is that they are so often answered before the evidence has even been examined. History deserves better. Scholarship deserves better. Truth deserves better. Because truth has never feared context. It depends upon it. And perhaps that is the simplest lesson of all. A verse without its context is not the whole truth. It is only the beginning of a story. And history has always demanded that we read the whole story.